Okay, so we'll start. My name is Brian O'Gallagher. I'm the Professor of Energy Engineering in University College Cork in Ireland. I'm also the Director for the MaREI Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine Research in Ireland. And I'm Chair of the International Energy Agency Technology Collaboration Programme on Energy Systems Modelling, IEA ETSAP. You're all very welcome to session 2 of IRENA's second international forum on long-term energy scenarios for the clean energy transition. In this session, we'll be exploring narratives and assumptions associated with long-term energy scenarios. So firstly, I'd like to thank IRENA for persevering with this event. This is an important event. It's the second annual event in this series. And given the changing circumstances that we all find ourselves in, switching to a webinar was, from my perspective, was the correct idea and solution to be able to maintain the event in spite of the circumstances. Dolph introduced the IRENA campaign, which has been run on behalf of the Clean Energy Ministerial, that focuses on long-term energy scenarios for the clean energy transition. And within IEA ETSAP, we've supported this initiative from the start, and we're very happy to be associated with this and to continue with our support. Dolph provided a useful distinction between 3 key steps in the process between model development on the one hand, scenario analysis on the other, and the policy process as the third. And we're going to focus here on the scenario analysis part. In particular, we'll be exploring narratives and assumptions. Narratives are effectively socioeconomic trends, so it focuses on the politics and societal changes behind any future scenario. The most known are those generated by the IPCC, the shared socioeconomic pathways. Assumptions then relate to technology. It could be costs, infrastructure, the role of digitalization and other trends. So we'll have 4 individual presentations and then we'll have time for discussions. I would encourage you, those who are watching, to send questions through the chat function. We'll try and get to these during the discussion session or else hopefully in some follow-up. What I'm hoping to gain from this session is some deeper understanding on the compatibility between national, regional and global narratives, explore some of the key technology trends required for the clean energy transition, and to explore also differences between scenarios generated by energy and by climate institutes. So as I mentioned, we'll start with some introductory presentations, and the first presentation will be delivered by Pablo Carvajal, who's an Associate Program Officer on Clean Energy Transition Scenarios for IRENA. So Pablo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction and for all the panelists that have joined to the session here at IRENA's second international forum on long-term energy scenarios for the clean energy transition. I want to talk about mapping narratives and assumptions in LTES, which is the acronym we use for long-term energy scenarios here at IRENA. And I want to start with showing the next slide, please, the parts of a scenario or the scenario building process in a very simplified manner. So you can see that it all starts with a narrative, followed by the assumption, then the model or the method used, and finally the results. So the key point here is that there's a distinction between what a narrative is and an assumption. And as Brian indicated in the beginning of the session, narratives are more a qualitative explanation, a written storyline of what is the future going to look like according to our visions and our objectives as a country, as a region, or as the globe. It is structured around determinants. Usually they're political and economical or social. They're specific to the system. They have to be tailor-made to the system that is being assessed with the scenario analysis. It also gives a framework for the meaning that the quantitative assumptions will have. So the narrative, which is the qualitative storyline, are the ones giving meaning to the numbers and the assumptions that are another type of data that we feed into our models or methods. And finally, it's usually formed through stakeholder consultations at varying levels. So although these are four parts of the scenario, they have to be in a way consecutive. So starting with the narrative ensures that the framing and the ideas that are going to be studied and expressed with the scenarios are in consensus with the stakeholders. Following the narratives and this bedrock of qualitative assumptions, we jump into the quantitative assumptions, which are the quantitative variables and the evolution defined beforehand. Most of these assumptions will be costs, they will be values that are set beforehand and are in perfect foresight in the future. So these values are only meaningful in the context of the narrative, and if the narrative changes, the assumptions of the costs should be assessed. Now we have assumptions usually on both sides of the energy system from an energy perspective, on the demand side and also on the supply side. On the energy demand side, the assumptions driving the scenario results will be population economic growth. Usually these are the strongest drivers of energy demand, and they can be addressed at different levels of disaggregation on the demand side and by economic and subsector of the economy. We also have the assumptions driving the energy supply, which is the availability of energy resources, the costs, and also the cost of technologies, which is also an assumption, a quantitative assumption that we feed into scenario building, scenario models. Now, these cost assumptions usually are more important when we're using least cost optimization models, which consider the price to find the optimal mix from the least cost perspective. In simulation methods, they are important as well, not important for the optimization process, but an important measure as well to define the cost of the simulated system. Next, please. So, making this different, let's talk about the pressing or the burning narratives that modelers or scenario builders have to face. And the question here is, what is driving the ongoing energy transformation? What is a narrative? What is the storyline that we're embracing that frames our scenario building process? And we can see two dimensions here. First of all, the policy imperatives, which is the first dimension of the main narratives that are leading now scenario building, which is sustainable development and economic growth. Of course, the SDGs come to mind right away. And the second policy imperative that is leading the narratives now for scenario building is, of course, the climate and environmental agenda aligned to the Paris Agreement. So in that small figure you can see on the screen is the REMAP scenario, the renewable energy roadmap scenario carried out by IRENA, in which we estimate that around 95% of emission reductions can be achieved through renewable energy and energy efficiency. Now, this is a scenario that is produced according to a narrative of a world that is aligned to a well below 2 degrees Celsius situation by end of the century. Now, the second tier, the second dimension is, of course, the storyline that renewable energy will have a greater and stronger business case as we move forward. And that policy frameworks and business and technology innovation allows for that business case to really deploy and expand thoroughly. And we can see that also that a narrative is to maintain the dramatic cost reductions not only on solar PV and wind, but also in offshore technologies for wind, storage, and other technologies. Next, please. Now, the previous slide was narratives, but now coming to the scenario level regarding the quantitative assumptions and what the modeler or the scenario developer has to face when he needs to model a whole energy system for whatever scale, a national, energy, or global. So here we have a figure that compares the cost on one side and the certainty of the date of entrance of these technologies, or the certainty of estimation of when it will be commercially available or deployed. Now, when it comes to modeling, the first question is, for example, if we look at hydrogen, we can see that it's a technology that is at the moment expensive, and there is low certainty of when it will be fully deployed and will be available for the context of a system. So the modeler faces this right away and says, when shall I make hydrogen technology available, and what costs and prices should I consider it to be deployed? And what we have done here is we've taken and we've put several areas where innovation needs to happen in the energy system, but more focused on the power system. And we can see we have grouped them according to enabling technologies, business models, system operation, and market design. All things that one way or another can be incorporated in an energy system model, hard link or soft link with other models. So you can see that you try to assess that certain enabling technologies like blockchain, artificial intelligence, digitalization, they're relatively cheaper, but there is still an uncertainty of when they will effectively advance into the energy system. We also have, for example, issues of market design. They are different, they located differently in where and when they will be deployed and what costs they will have. So these assumptions are very, very important to define beforehand, and they will usually take a perfect foresight assessment if we're using a partial equilibrium model of the energy system. There are those who as well who do a general equilibrium approach and try to endogenize the cost of these technologies. As they deploy, they get cheaper, but that's another discussion for sure. But the energy model or the energy scenario developer has to face and has to have an answer in this transition, or an estimation, or a scenario itself of where and when these technologies will be deployed and at what cost is to use according to their context. Next, please. So just to wrap it up, we're studying here at IRENA these things, and we're trying to map out these narratives and assumptions, especially for ambitious scenarios that want to have important achievements in decarbonization. So this is to promote our coming soon joint IRENA ECJRC expert workshop. And this is to exchange the experience in long-term energy scenario comparison. So we want to compare the scenario comparisons. We know there are institutions worldwide comparing scenarios, and intercomparison studies have some time, and they are very common among certain institutions. But we want to extract what is important and what we can learn from scenario comparison studies. Now you can see that below that many institutions produce scenarios, and we can compare them, but what comes out of the comparison and how we can feed back the insights learned from scenario comparison in the scenario development process. So what are the main divergences? What are the key interests of different scenarios that I produce for different purposes around the globe? And finally, our intention with this workshop that is coming up is to try to find if there's a systematic way or to formalize the knowledge around the comparison of scenarios to bring more clarity to decision making. And while we're doing that, find out the assumptions and the underlying assumptions that drive each scenario from each institution. So next, please. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Pablo. I really liked that as an overview, and two of the things that jumped out at me from what you said were the differences in the implications of costs depending on the different modeling approach that's been used, be it least cost or simulation, which I agree with. And that juxtaposition of the cost of projections of different technologies versus certainty of large-scale deployment. And I think that workshop that you spoke about will be of significant interest. So thank you very much. We're going to move now to the second presentation. So Tiina Koljonen is a principal scientist in VTT Technical Research Centre of Finland, a long-term collaborator of mine in the IEA ETSAP community. So I'm delighted to welcome you, Tiina, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Over to you.
Thank you, Brian, and greetings to all from Finnish countryside. So I must be honest that I'm a little bit excited about this very new thing for me to connect to this kind of conference next to the lake from our summer cottage. But So good so far. And thank you also all the IRENA people for the hard work for organizing this very important workshop. So thank you very much. But next one, please. So I will talk about the existing situation in Finland at the moment and a little bit about the background. So the existing government of Finland has set an ambitious target to become carbon neutral by 2035 and carbon negative already after that. So this is, I guess, one of the most ambitious targets around the world, but we are working very hard for that. In addition to the carbon neutrality target by 2035, it is now said that we should do that without any international trade compensation mechanisms. So we are really looking after the measures and policies at the moment in Finland, how to reach the target. At VTT, we have rather long experience with these multidisciplinary research projects to create alternative narratives. And we have done the work to quantify, which Pablo just very well described, that going from the qualitative narratives and storylines is very important, that we are also quantifying the narratives and storylines and doing the impact assessments, quantitative scenario assessment, and so on. So next, please. So this is one example about narratives we have been working, in fact, already for 10 years. On the right-hand side, you can see the picture of the very first project we were running inside VTT. So we started with our own people to do the job and lessons learned, and even hired a graphic designer to visualize the narratives. So we were aiming at anyway to integrate stakeholders, people, tell the stories, and in fact, this kind of graphical designing seemed to be very valuable exercise for everybody. In that exercise, we create 3 storylines or narratives called in Finnish, Tonni, Inno, and Onni. People are still remember them, but now we are moving to so-called continuous growth, safe narrative, change, and stagnation. I will talk more about these 2 first ones, but honestly, I must say that even though we have been working more or less 10 years for the radical change scenarios and so-called collapse or stagnation scenarios, I think those are the most difficult ones for everybody. Now we are more or less facing this kind of a stagnation scenario, but this is, of course, the narrative we haven't been able to realize at all. So new exercises definitely will come. The next, please. This is the situation we are facing now in Finland. So if I a little bit open first about the 4 narratives which were listed there in the previous slides. The growth scenario expected that globally we are facing growth, markets are open, the technologies will develop very fast, and also the technologies will be implemented very fast all around the world. So this is some kind of a dream scenario. In that scenario, we expected that there is very high electrification, digitalization, urbanization is very high, especially in Finland, but also all around the world. The change scenario, like I mentioned, that assumed that we are really facing radical technological changes. We are facing very radical, for example, behavioral changes. For example, people move more eating vegetable-based or foods, and the way of consuming is changing. In the same scenario, we were expecting that it's more based on the, for example, circular economy. So in that scenario, we were expecting that, for example, we are having very much renewable-based industries. For example, fossil fuel utilization will be decreased in all the industries. We are moving, for example, to power-to-X technologies, to new ways of utilizing biomaterials, biochemicals, and so on. And then we have this stagnation, so we can call that is sort of a risk scenario. So all the other three scenarios, they are achieving at least 2 degrees global mitigation. But in the risk scenario, we have been expecting that the global climate policy fails. So this is the scenario framework where we have been creating the narratives. So we have been creating stories to all of these narratives. We have, for example, making some stories that how the living in this kind of world would look like. What kind of lifestyle changes there could be if you are sitting in this kind of world. And also even we are having these technical reports, very typical for the scenario reports. We have also included the stories about these narratives. In the right-hand side, just recently we published how Finland will reach the carbon neutrality in 2035 and become even carbon negative after that. Bottom, you can see what is really the role of forest land. So the gross net LULUCF, land use, land purchase, and forestry sector. So in all the exercises and scenario modeling, we have already soft linked the LULUCF modeling, which is very, very important in Finland because about 70% of our land area is forest-based, but on the other hand, we are very relying on our forest industries. We are having a lot of bioenergy. We are looking for new bio-based industries. So the forest sector is extremely important. But on the other hand, we are not able to achieve the carbon neutrality without utilizing the opportunity to compensate with the forest sinks. One of the important things were, for example, were the assumptions there for the possibility to utilize carbon capture and storage. In the growth scenario, we were expecting that no CCS is available in Finland or globally. On the other hand, in the same scenario, we were expecting that we are able to utilize fossil and bio-based CCS. So CCS integrated to the industries, but especially in Finland, we have a great opportunity to utilize bio-CCS, and in that sense also compensate the emissions. The red line shows the net greenhouse gas emissions. So we are including all the Kyoto greenhouse gases plus the LULUCF sector. You can see in the same scenario, the graph shows very, very deep greenhouse gas reduction after 2030. On the other hand, in the growth scenario, the change after 2030 is not so deep, but anyway, the challenge is very extensive. Next, please. Then this was one very typical example using times modeling framework, which Brian is very familiar with. There on the left-hand side, we show that what is happening to the energy sector. So to reach the carbon neutrality by 2035, you can see that both the growth and save scenarios must be more or less carbon-free, both in electricity and heat. I must say that electricity is easy, but in heat sector, we are facing really challenge. In Finland, we already include phase out of coal by 2030. But like in Ireland, we also have peat problem. So also we still need to phase out peat. And the next is then, of course, natural gas. Then on the right-hand side, you can see that in the save scenarios, we have these negative emissions that's coming from bio-CCS. And on the other hand, in the growth scenarios, we don't have the opportunity for utilizing the technical-based negative emissions. So in that sense, the only opportunity is then to utilize the forest sinks to compensate the emissions. But again, you can see that, yes, thank you. Very deep emission reduction in after 2030 need to be faced. The next, please. So this is my last slide. Even though we have been looking at for a long time, I must be honest that this kind of exercises needs relatively large amount of resources, both time, people, monetary resources, and I guess that especially if you go to the policy work, this could be a bottleneck, because you know that when the government needs some results, we have to act very quickly. So that's the reason that we need to do this continuous development all the time. This is just a list that what is happening now. After we have solved this corona crisis, the government is definitely will go ahead with the energy and climate policies, and I know that they are working, despite all the situation, they are working still with the climate and energy issues. In Finland, we will update our climate and energy strategy. We will update our medium-term climate policy plan. Our climate law is under development. We are renewing our energy taxation. And of course, we are looking for also what is coming from EU. All this is happening within 1 year, we hope. So on the right, I have these white graphs. So we still don't know exactly how these will be filled. But this kind of large collaboration with the other research institutes, stakeholders, and policymakers is very much recommended, because a lot of good lessons to learn. We haven't seen that how large is large, what is small, what are the risks, what are the opportunities, and then on the other hand, because we don't know the future, this anyway gives some ideas that what might happen in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tiina. There were three things that I took away from that. firstly, from your first slide, the ambition of Finland is striking to seek to achieve carbon neutrality by 2035. Secondly, the challenges you outlined in developing narratives and trying to put quantification and turn them into scenarios. And thirdly, the ambition in your last slide to try and achieve so much in the next year. So best of luck with that. Okay, we'll move on. I'm conscious of time. So next up is Sven Teske, Research Director at the Institute for Sustainable Futures in the University of Technology in Sydney. Sven, it was my pleasure to meet you at the event last year, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I jump straight in. Could I get the first slide or the next slide? So the first question is, what are the narratives used by different national governments in the LTES? I basically went back and I thought, I'm not presenting the book cover I sneaked in the presentation to do a little commercially for our book, but I'm going through the different NDCs from different countries. So I downloaded NDCs from countries we have modeled, not all of them, but most of them have modeled over the last 2 years, and see what kind of narratives they actually used. And for example, Switzerland, if you check, Switzerland does not use the term renewable energy in the entire NDC, which is quite remarkable. And also, Switzerland first tried to compare themselves to the rest of the world and how little emissions they actually contribute to climate change. This is a scheme we see very often, especially from smaller countries. If the per capita emissions are very high from those smaller, richer countries, they usually use the global figure and compare to their total emissions, and then it looks pretty small. Vietnam and cost-efficient mitigation potential and abatement costs are the core aspects. In consideration of a fair contribution of a country. So you see that in those NDCs, very vague formulations, very vague storylines are actually embedded. In Vietnam, the NDC or the target for CO2 reduction is compared to a business as usual scenario. And it's pretty difficult to find which one, because they have several. And we did a scenario exercise for Vietnam last year, and I had the privilege to model quite a lot around Vietnam, and there are several business as usual scenarios over the years. So this is another interesting storyline. First, it's the business as usual scenario, where the CO2 reduction target is developed on top of it. But I have to say Vietnam has a very detailed and very structured approach of introducing targets for energy efficiency as well as for renewables, because there are very detailed directives and guidelines and even laws towards an energy efficiency plan and implementation of renewables. So I think that's an interesting read to actually see what Vietnam implemented in their storyline and what narrative they started with. My new home country, Australia, has a very, very vague collection of phrases, and although we do have targets for renewable energy and energy efficiency, but no long-term targets, unfortunately. There are quite a few references to removals of carbon emission, which means CCS. I'm coming to that later. Also, Saudi Arabia is quantifying the overall amount of emissions over a year, but not sort of the overall emission as such, but only the amount of removed or reduced emissions. and also very vague in the storyline, a robust contribution from oil exporting revenues to the national economy, which basically means that even though this exercise is actually towards a total decarbonization, it's built in that the oil industry must contribute to the revenues to the national economy, which basically means embedded. There's either CCS or hydrogen or both embedded in that storyline. And only Costa Rica has a very clear 100% renewable energy matrix for 2030, with an increase of energy efficiency and industrial and residential consumptions. But the transport sector is not really included in that to a large extent, or just quite vaguely. So if we would go through all the NDCs, and there are about 155 or 160 uploaded currently at the UNFCCC site, website, then we, I think, would find a very, very interesting mix of storylines and narratives we probably have to include in our future modeling. Next slide, please. And the next slide, if I get it. What are the key technologies and policy trends required / expected in the long term for carbon neutral energy systems by mid-century? I got this question from from IRENA, and I wasn't really clear if a trend's required or if a trend's expected. So I try to answer both. So the key technology trends required, and I think that's also reflected in the first session where high electrification and sector coupling played a huge role, is that the renewable energy generation driven, that's basically a focus on PV, onshore and offshore wind, and solar and geothermal heat. I think those technologies in the power and heat sector are increasing by far. PV is by far the most important one, followed by onshore wind and offshore wind. Renewable heat is not really booming, especially not solar heat. Geothermal, if I include heat pumps into geothermal heat, then this is seriously booming, but this is electric heating, basically. A trend towards increased electrification in transport and heat, that's including storage concepts, so that's the required technology trends in most of the scenarios to achieve the targets, the Paris Climate Agreement goal, as well as strong efficiency measures and strong efficiencies components. So I haven't really seen any high renewable penetration scenario with more or less no efficiency measures. Efficiency is obviously super important in the assumption, but also it is somehow, from my point of view, separated from the measures for generations. So you can't actually sort of approach both at the same time. I'll go into that a bit more detail for the policy. But the key technology trends which I expect to be discussed is, and that's quite often, and I heard it already, technology neutral. We have to be technology neutral, and if we are technology neutral, we have to include all technologies, which I have no problem with. But we also have to include unproven technologies which are actually not on the market, like CCS, or sometimes even fusion. But fusion is almost in no scenarios. I think I've seen only one. And very uneconomic technologies like nuclear. I think a few countries like also Finland and France can have experienced the extreme cost explosions of those technologies, and then bridge technologies to basically expand the bridge, are quite often used for that in terms of blue hydrogen, which is basically CCUS hydrogen. And then the key policy trends required, we need binding targets for that, for the approach, and we need binding sectorial and CO2 and renewable energy targets. and a long-term strategic decision for a specific energy pathways to start implementing infrastructural changes, because that is very important that we decide at some point in time to what extent we actually want to electrify, and then we actually implement infrastructural changes. And that's a long-term decision. And besides a long-term decision for renewable energy and energy efficiency target, we also need to have a very clear idea of by when we phase out fossil fuels, and not just sort of ignore that or try to not answer that question, because that's extremely important also for just transition to actually restructure the employment market. But what I expect in the trend in the future is that we discuss in length the carbon price and expected negative social impacts of this carbon price. And because technology neutral and market driven plus inclusion of CCS and nuclear means that we have to make the most uneconomic technologies economic, and that only works with a very high carbon price. And efficiency is focused on voluntary lifestyle changes. I think we all have experienced in the past that didn't work. Right now with the Corona crisis, we see how forced lifestyle changes actually have a huge impact, but not to our life, sort of way of life, not a positive one. So there are also measures in terms of change technologies. Next slide, please. So how the global trends reflected in the national LTES. So I think most of the scenarios actually reflect that solar and wind, mainly PV and onshore wind, will accelerate and will dominate, but a lot of those scenarios still include niche technologies like CCS. The global vehicle market trends toward electric mobility is basically in most scenarios reflected, and I think that's a good thing. There is almost a consensus to what extent we electrify. However, we have sometimes in the long-term energy scenario a problem with the system analysis, because if we have very high variable wind shares, renewable energy shares, we can't actually have base load generation, or not a very high percentage, and that's quite often not reflected. And storage uptake in many long-term scenarios not really implemented, not really reflected, and I think there is room for improvement. And how can global LTES be reconciled with national level to comply with the Paris Agreement? I think we need more and accelerate to use integrated models which take also natural carbon sinks into the equations. That's like forests. Tiina actually presented one where this is included to some extent. I think we need to be more also the natural carbon sinks. We need to define more the national carbon budgets, a very specific budget target, and define regional and sectorial energy and carbon intensity targets. I think that makes it a bit difficult, easier to actually justify some storylines. And the last slide, and I'm finishing in 1 minute. The key differences between the LTES produced by energy-oriented institutions and the scenario produced by the climate community. The energy institutions, by definition, do not really define technology-based targets. That's absolutely understandable. If, for example, the IEA needs to represent all the sort of the sector, all the different parts of the energy sector, and it's for the IEA extremely difficult to say this and this and this technology will be excluded in the future because of reason A and B. So therefore, it's a bit vague in terms of just telling it carbon neutral, and so allow all technology to be in. Also, those institutions do not really suggest a phase out of coal, oil, and gas. And I found it really interesting that when we had this session last year, we all agreed that we have to decarbonize the energy system, but we can't all agree that we actually have to phase out fossil fuels, which was for me a surprise, because how can we decarbonize without phasing out fossil fuels? There is, CCS, but we have less than 40 applications worldwide, so not sure if that's actually really possible. And then cost projections for renewable energies often way too high. We see that an ongoing thing for the last World Energy Outlooks, except the last one or two, which I have to say are much better now. But also the current IM scenarios from the IPCC, the costs projections for solar PV are up to factor 4 too high, which is actually a little. And the climate communities focus more on renewable and energy efficiency, define really clear targets, but not really have no vested interest in technologies. But the problem is cost projections for efficiency are often not included because it's difficult. And those scenarios are quite often not too detailed. And I think my time's up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sven. I think that was a very interesting presentation. You discussed the varying focus amongst different countries on whether they mentioned or didn't explicitly renewable energy. You distinguished between technologies expected and technologies required. And you spoke about some of the differences in approach that you've seen between energy institutes and climate institutes. And I think there's a lot of things we could discuss there. Unfortunately, we are behind time. I'll move quickly to Wouter Nijs, and hopefully we will have some time at the end for discussion. Wouter is with the European Commission, the Joint Research Centre, and also a long-standing member of the ETSAP community. So I've known Wouter for many years. It's a pleasure to see you, Wouter, and I'll hand the floor to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I work for the unit of the JRC that supports the energy union policies and the transition to a climate neutral economy with scientific evidence. Credits for today's presentation also go to Yannis Tsiropoulos, who unfortunately could not be with us. So my next slide, please. The EU Green Deal can be considered the narrative of the EU with a focus on emission goals. So the slide is there to show this is the new narrative, and that it's also the context in which we, as from the science perspective, are operating. Next slide, please. With reference to the clean energy for all Europeans, or the strategic long-term vision, the narratives are set via 8 different scenarios. That's a communication that came out in end of 2018. And the narratives are based on main options for decarbonization, whether it's a focus on technology or a mix of technologies. 2 out of 8 are 1.5 scenarios, 1.5 tech, 1.5 live. And this communication, the current 2030 policy targets are based on this clean energy for all Europeans, but the EU Green Deal seeks to strengthen the impact on emissions. So new scenarios are underway to feed the impact assessment that will come out in the summer. Next slide, please. At the JRC, we compare narratives, assumptions, and results of energy scenarios. That's maybe a bit new, what you will see now, because we won't just show European Commission scenarios. So since 2017, more than 67 energy scenarios have been published from a variety of sources. And the graph you see shows emission trajectories based on energy-related and processed CO2. The blue-colored have been further analyzed by our team. And from these 67 scenarios, there's nearly a third reaching 50% reduction by 2030. 2/3 are reaching 80% by 2050. And around 1 out of 4, so 19 scenarios, reach more than 90% reduction. And this is where we focus on in my my next two slides. Thank you. So these slides contain not yet published material. The matrix you see shows different results, narratives, assumptions in scenarios that, apart from three, reach more than 90% reduction. It's complex in the sense that you see 5 dimensions. On the horizontal axis, you see how much energy efficiency is playing a role. On the vertical axis, you see how we have grouped these scenarios according to their res share. And then there is 3 more levels that, with the colors showing some technology detail. It's a very useful picture on how we can look and think about narratives regarding, for example, lifestyle that clearly affect demand and reduction of final energy. So the more you go to the right, you will see EC LTES 1.5 live is different from EC LTES 1.5 tech. The ECF scenarios, European Climate Foundation, are on the right. Another example are norms on strong presence or absence of technologies, like the nuclear or the CCS. If it's a white color, they are absent. And in some scenarios, the narrative, indeed, as announced by Pablo, they determine the technology assumptions. From the exercise, we have derived several similarities and differences between scenarios. I spent some time on both. Storage of CO2, yes, to different levels, but some of them with levels above 200 megaton per year. Still, this also means that there is no scenario that is storing CO2 at the level anything close to a large fraction of today's emissions. So the largest similarity between all scenarios is that they all reduce the use of fossil by at least 1,000 megaton oil equivalent, which is actually around 60% of our current gross EU climate consumption. Other similarities are electrification, the role of renewables, zero emission vehicles, electricity meeting up to or between 40 and 60% of the building's energy demand, with a notable increase of heat pumps. But then there's also several differences. Assumptions on industrial production levels, building renovation, utilization and occupancy of different modes of transport. They all have a large impact on the reduction of final energy demand, and there are huge differences. Another difference is how aviation and marine are decarbonized. And lastly, the size of the power sector and the power supply. The scenarios with a huge growth, indeed a factor 2 or even sometimes 3, through direct electrification, hydrogen e-fuels, and the use of electrolyzers. If it's a slow growth, that's through a strong energy demand reduction. Next and last slide, please. Thank you. We stay in 2050 and plot the electrification on the horizontal axis, which is defined as the share of directly used electricity over the total final energy use, and the vertical axis shows the direct electricity consumption itself. Each sector has a color. Today's, and with the yellow, that's something I have to say, the yellow color is where we are today. Looking at the horizontal axis, all scenarios show much higher levels of electrification. For example, about half of the industrial energy demand may be directly electrified. Looking at the vertical axis, where there's an expansion or a reduction of the absolute direct use of electricity in buildings, in industry, depends on the narrative. So not all scenarios show an increase of the absolute use of electricity in buildings. However, transport is a sector that increases its demand for electricity across all scenarios, even though it seems like a smaller amount. This is a huge impact on the sector. Mind that this is every, let's say, terawatt hour of electricity replaces 3 to 4 terawatt hours of oil. Of course, this is not the full electricity production, because there the increase is much larger. To come to a certain conclusion, let's say that regarding narratives and assumptions, we faced many challenges in this comparison exercise with respect to what is available, how transparent they are on critical assumptions. But struggling through this all, we think that being open about all available scenarios and their differences is very powerful. We already distilled many insights on how scenarios compare, and we conclude that all scenarios reduce the use of fossil by at least 1,000 megaton oil equivalent. They mainly differ in the level of energy demand. And related to that energy demand, the increase of renewables. So the renewables, level of renewables, which then is often electricity and derived fuels. This is a completely different picture from just simply integration of renewables. It's rather finding new uses of those renewables. And I think I can end there in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wouter. You've presented very clearly the new EU narrative, some of the different elements in the Clean Planet for All, and then some insights from the 67 scenario results that you discussed. Now, we have 4 minutes left. We will finish at 10:50. So I've only time for one question. I want to put to Wouter and Tiina a challenge that I see in what Sven has raised. And the question is, have you compared 100% renewable energy scenarios with deep decarbonization, as in net zero emission scenarios by 2050? Because clearly, if it's 100% renewable energy, or if it's net zero by 2050, you'll get the same result in terms of CO2 emissions, but you'll have a very different mix. So can you each take a minute to say whether you've compared, and if so, what jumps out at you? Tiina first, maybe.
Thank you. I think this is an excellent topic and question. Remember that in Finland we are having this nuclear, so 100% renewable will require that we will have a stranded costs of the also the Olkiluoto, which should be operational this year, and then also probably the forthcoming. Let's see. So 100% renewable is not probably that kind of storyline we are expecting, but we have been doing the exercises anyway. We have also run this 100% renewable scenarios. The most tricky thing comes from industrial sector. How to really decarbonize the whole industrial sector. Yes, we can do it. Requires a lot of power to X. Well, then we have the chemical industries. We have made some exercises also, so utilizing CO2 from the atmospheres, but of course, these kind of scenarios we are not having in our hands when we are going to discuss with our government or policymakers. But of course, change scenario included huge amount of renewables. But anyway, the whole energy sector is carbon free. So nuclear and renewable, and then some fossils will be there in the industrial sector, which is very, very expensive to decarbonize.
Wouter? Thank you, Tiina.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question and the opportunity. So maybe the first point I would like to make is that there's a difference between, let's say, the 100% renewable scenarios, like say the share of renewables, as you could also see from my slide, although it was very quick, but it's not necessarily the scenarios that have the highest level of renewable. There are scenarios which are like that more diversified with even higher levels, exactly for the reason Tiina was also mentioning. If you want to decarbonize the industry, you may need to have a less efficient but renewable-based system that provides hydrogen or derived fuels like e-fuels. And the second point on this is that, so yes, we have in a sense integrated and compared all of those. My second point is regarding CCS. It's not necessarily always part of the energy system. There are 100% renewable scenarios, or close to 100%, which still store carbon permanently. So there's not necessarily one or the other.
Thank you very much, and apologies to the other two panelists for not having time to come back to you. And I also apologize to those who sent in questions. We've run out of time, but we will distribute the questions to the panelists and seek to arrange a follow-up in that way. So thank you all very much, the panelists and those for listening in, and thanks again to IRENA for organising this event in these circumstances. And I look forward to the rest of the day. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.